Isn't it fascinating how small changes in attitudes and practices can make a world of difference for autistic employees? In this episode, we will tackle one of the most pressing issues in today's workforce, autism misconceptions. Join us as we sit down with Angela Nelson to uncover the truths behind the myths and explore how we can dismantle barriers to create a more inclusive workplace for all. Hi, I'm Dr. Teresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to have you join us today as we discuss some prevailing myths and the need to dismantle workplace barriers for autistic individuals. Joining us for our conversation today is Dr. Angela Nelson, a clinical services executive whose research and advocacy have illuminated the complexities of autism inclusion at work. In her most recent study, she found a lack of understanding among neurotypical managers, the absence of inclusive policies, and that there's still a stigma attached to neurodiversity. I believe her insights will give us a front seat into this latest topic. So thank you for joining us today, Angela. So glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm really excited for our guests to get your insights on your research. But before we go straight into the meat and potatoes, I would love to know more about your background. What led you to focus your research on supporting autistic individuals?
Oh gosh, I'll give the quick rundown. It actually started a long time ago when I was a kid. In fact, my best friend from middle school, her brother is autistic, now a 30-something-year-old man. But at the time, they asked me to babysit for him. And she said, well, first, let me ask, do you know about the word, have you heard the word autism before? And I said, no, I've never heard that word before. And so that was kind of my initial introduction to autism. Really cool guy, really cool kid, just really fascinated by autism. And so that was when I first was introduced to it. Fast forward to college, I took classes on autism at UCLA. That kind of just brought me back to it. And I determined at that time, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I really want to dive into this. And so, the day after graduation, I started working with children with a variety of developmental disabilities, working on potty training and teaching self-advocacy skills and self-help skills and so on. One thing I noticed at the time was the parents, because we're in the home, and I was really interested in understanding more about the parents and the family dynamics. So at that time, I actually got a master's in counseling, and I focused on that population. And then fast forward to present day, I work at a company called Rethink First. My specific branch of it is called Rethink Care. And we rolled out a program to support parents and really teach them and empower them to teach their kids skills, self-advocacy skills, communication skills, ways to, get their needs met and pursue their goals. And it's actually a program that is supported by employees. It's an employer-sponsored benefit. So the people using the program are employees. They don't have to pay for it. Their company pays for it. And kind of bringing up to my current practice right now, the companies were saying, gosh, you're supporting our employees who are parents, but we have neurodivergent employees here that we would love to have more support and kind of more supports built around, and even supporting our managers and our leaders to be more inclusive. So can you help us with that? And so that kind of brings us to where we are now. We created a whole new program around that too, to really elevate neurodiversity at work.
And so there's that bridge. You started with the parent and the carer, and a lot of people started as carers. And in some ways you were the babysitter, and then you were the counselor to parents and others. But then you have this engagement with managers. And so there's this two-sided coin of how do I help somebody be their best self? And then there's that flip, and this is where your research came in, was how can managers open the door to ensure support so employees can come in?
Right. Yep. Exactly. It was kind of a journey to get here.
So when you look at that, there's that two side. How is, when you think about parental supports, we often think about like the caretaker component, but there is a support function. Do you see is there a relation to the parental support and manager support work that you're doing?
Yeah. In some ways it's separate, but I think the bridge there is you have an employee that comes and they identify as a parent who has a child, maybe who's neurodivergent. They also know that their company offers programming for neurodivergent employees. And I think that bridge is that it really helps encourage and kind of infuse some enthusiasm for that employee, knowing that, you know what, my child's going to grow up. Maybe they're going to work here too. And the company that I'm working for is not only helping me, but also supporting not just the hiring, but the growth and the growth trajectory of neurodivergent individuals. And that's really exciting. And so I think that's kind of the bridge between the two from my experience.
And so like one of the things, we don't like to talk about autism as a disability, but we definitely are all here because there's barriers and challenges, not just getting education and proper supports, but then getting employment. When we think about the barriers, I think one of the things carers and parents are always working towards is kind of being that first voice against those myths and barriers. And then folks like you and I, advocates, are doing the same. What are the myths and barriers right now? What are we really working? What does the current look like?
Yeah. So what I found in my research, I know we'll probably dive in a little bit more to it, but a lot of the managers that I spoke to felt or made some assumptions, or certainly implicit bias. They made some assumptions that autistic individuals required more support than they actually did, or that they were more significantly impacted by autism than they are. And we see a lot of successes in the workplace of autistic individuals, and that's kind of the impetus for why I wanted to do this research and look at the managers and the organizational structures, because I think that's where a lot of the barriers lie. It's, historically, we've looked at the challenges within the individual. And I wanted to, and I know in your work, you also do this too, is to look at the other side, look at the managers, look at the organizations, and kind of dispel some of those myths and realize that there are some major gaps on that side. Lack of information, lack of awareness, lack of experience interacting with autistic individuals, which drive some of these, sustaining these barriers in place.
As you were talking, and it's something I've said before, but I really want to focus on a bit more. I think one of the issues, as we're talking and as I'm thinking about it, is that employers originally started helping parents. Making sure parents had resources. So the narrative of what they were hearing about autistic individuals tend to be early years or younger. Not saying that parents don't have adult children with autism and need support, but the predominant conversation is usually in the formative years. So employers are hearing about these challenges that their employees' parents with autistic children may have. And so they start to base this narrative, but that's not the adult autistic narrative. And so then you have parents going, I need to flip the script. I got support from my children. Now they're capable adults. Now there's all these barriers. In some ways, us asking for help kind of showed the underbelly of problems. And now we're trying to be like, but these are really capable individuals.
Right.
Do you think there might be some truth to that?
Absolutely. I haven't really thought of it that way, but it's kind of like the parents are lobbying for more supports, and rightfully so. There's literature showing mental health implications and there are just additional logistics, no matter how you slice it or dice it. When you have a child who has an IEP and you have additional therapy appointments and so on, there's just a lot of additional logistics and stress. And they go and they advocate, and the companies say, oh gosh, we really need to support this population of parents. And then they have a picture in their mind of what autism is, but maybe that's the case when your child is 3 and they're trying to talk and they're maybe having some tantrum behaviors because they're trying to advocate and communicate for themselves. That's not what it looks like when they're 33 per se. So yeah, it can be, I think it's a little tricky.
Because people base their assumptions, create their schema based on what they hear and know. So if all you've ever heard is about childhood autism, you're really not giving a good chance and a picture of what teen and adult autism may look like. And one of the things I like to say to folks, and I think you've heard this too, where it's like, well, they throw tantrums. And I'm like, all 3-year-olds throw tantrums?
Yeah.
Right? I've never held, neurotypical folks are not held to their 3 to 5-year-old behavior in adulthood. Mm-hmm. And so I do think it's an interesting concept that as you were talking, I was like, in our attempts to get support, have we created a narrative that's actually, I don't want to say it caused the stigma, but kind of perpetuates this thought because we only understand what we hear and know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I'd like you to kind of like take a moment and walk us through, like, what are some of the myths? Like, what are some of the myths and stereotypes we're really trying to work through?
Yeah, I think the myths really are that people see, from my research and just the day-to-day work of managers, people, well, I think that's somewhat fed by the fact that we don't have enough autistic individuals working and thriving in organizations right now because of these barriers. And so people don't have exposure. And so the myths are that they are more impacted by their disability. Or another common myth, which is in the literature, is they're going to bombard financially the organization, and then they're going to require all these accommodations, which we know from research that that's not necessarily true, but that they would create more work. And that is definitely something I saw in the literature and in my own research too, is, I don't know how it's going to impact business. Is it going to be hard? Is it going to be that other colleagues are going to hold a grudge because they think that they're getting special treatment, or that their colleague who's autistic is getting special treatment? So there's all these kind of thoughts and assumptions that go in to perpetuate these myths, which I think are in part why we still have this underrepresentation.
And then the leaders don't ask because they make the assumption, they just opt out.
Yeah.
So one of the big areas, before we can even support autistic employees in the workplace, although I do think people need to clean their house and ready their cultures, is even getting in the door. But that can be concerning for managers. So what are some of the first steps of overcoming a manager's concerns just about hiring autistic talent?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I would say educating yourself, getting a little bit more educated. I think we've come a long way in our DEIA kind of initiatives. We've educated ourselves more on race and gender and so on. But, being able to educate and learn a little bit. Also, I think it's important to reflect on our own management and leadership styles. How flexible and adaptable are we? How are our own skill sets in being able to pivot when we need to, or adjust the way that we support someone based on the way that they're communicating or acting or behaving, maybe thinking beyond our usual hires. A lot of the things that we know to be true about supporting autistic individuals, they're not really that hard to do if you think about it. Little tweaks here and there. I was just on a call the hour before this, and this individual was saying how the person that they're working with, they would roll out a project, and then the manager would say, "Do you understand?" And then the person would say, "Yes." And then later they would go weeks, and then the product would come back and it was not what the manager expected. And I said, so you said, not everybody is going to say, no, I don't understand. Can you go back? This is the exact moment that you lost me. So being able to stop and make a tweak, like, hey, let's talk about what you heard, how you understand the project. Let's dive in. And then you can kind of pinpoint maybe where the miscommunication started or where there was a disconnect, sending a bulleted list of, hey, this is what the project is, clear deadlines, those sorts of things. Those aren't really that hard to do. So I do think there's a lot of self-reflection that hiring managers need to do, be able to kind of empower themselves with some additional skills to not just support autistic employees, but all employees that might think and communicate differently than yourself.
Or that just making things unnecessarily hard. I like to think of the character in The Devil Wears Prada, where when people asked her questions, she's like, don't bore me with your questions. Like she literally was she made the environment difficult to see who would sink or swim. And so I'm not saying managers are, that overtly difficult to work with, but there is something to be said about this is how we do things. There's some leaders that are like, read my mind. They may not even really know what they want. And I think that happens when we talk about the hiring process. And so I want your thoughts on this too. One of the common accommodations for interviews is giving the questions beforehand.
Yep.
And it's kind of like giving extra test time in schools, all the backlash of, well, that's not fair to other people. And the first thing I like to say is, do you have a standard protocol? Mm-hmm. Are the questions even available to give to somebody if they wanted them? Because that's usually the first thing. The answer is no.
Right.
They do not have a standard protocol. It's an extroverted conversation that they base on whim. Mm-hmm. And so that would be the first barrier. Do you even have ethical and standard hiring practices? Mm-hmm. Then if they do say, oh, yes, I do have a protocol and we do ask consistent questions, why can't you give them to everybody?
Right.
So there's this mindset of, well, we want to make sure people are on their toes. Are they a public relations executive, right? Like, what are you hiring them to do here?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I've had the same question or the same conversation with our director of people and culture. And that was a process that our company went through, standardizing the questions. And I know that there were some managers that were not interested in that because they felt like they were put in too much of a rigid box. They wanted to be able to, throw random questions out there and kind of be flexible. And so there are definitely going to be people that are going to go against that. But, when you think about it, giving it ahead of time, not just as a quote unquote advantage to someone, but for everybody, that's universal design, right? That's really making it easier for everybody. And sure, you can, if the opportunity presents itself, maybe you have additional questions here and there, but to standardize, it just, I think, levels the playing field quite a bit.
I mean, it actually gives a protocol of, are you measuring what you think you are in that process? Mm-hmm. You mentioned your head of culture and transformation. How big of a part does that play in all of this culture?
That is huge. That is actually something that was one of my unexpected findings of my research. I was expecting much more in the area of the neurotypical manager, lack of, skills and knowledge, but the culture, HR, just the culture and climate, I mean, that's what drives the policies. That's what drives the protocols, the written and unwritten rules, down to how meetings are run, how people kind of interact with each other. It's that, we do it this way because that's how we've always done it, those sorts of things. And I think the culture kind of sends a message to the employees on what they value, right? What the company spends money on says a lot about their values. So I do think that the company culture is one of the most important pieces here in autism in the workplace, for sure.
Yeah. And then when you think about culture, you got the organizational culture, and then you have the team culture. And when I think about accommodations and that concern of, is this fair and equitable, it really is that team manager culture, because if my manager is not flexible with us today and I can't leave early to go to a doctor's appointment and, we're penalized because we didn't turn something in 2 hours, then you are probably going to have some dissonance when you bring in somebody with a documented disability who then gets flexible time and the reprieve to go to the doctors. And you're kind of creating unnecessary dissonance. And I always ask, why are you so strict in general? Yes, we could get a document that justifies the accommodation, but why? What do you think drives people to this rigid, you must work our way to be successful?
I think, kind of diving into my background in behavior, I think that sometimes people have a hard time with change. They have a hard time with being adaptable. Some people do feel comfortable with routine, so much so, and that in an organizational setting, they might be, too rigid, or they might kind of over rotate and say well, it has to be this way, it has to be this way for everybody. This is just the way we've always done it. And I don't know, I don't think it serves anybody really well. I think we can point to the pandemic as a good example of that. And you look at the companies that are still allowing people to have flexible schedules. We saw that people were not just employees, but they were actually people with kids and their own logistics, right? And those people got a lot more flexibility. When you look at people that work at companies like that help to individualize and to say, hey, yeah, let's get this stuff done. But, if you need to go to a doctor's appointment at 2 p.m., you get it, you can work later, not so rigid. Those people are happier. I mean, it just makes more sense for the business. You have less turnover, I imagine, so yeah, and I don't know. I do think it comes back to, change and people having a hard time with change and flexibility sometimes.
And relinquishing control. One of the things I always like to throw out there, I hear folks that are in retail, in restaurants, in factories, conformity, consistency, could be safety, right? You have to be at work at a certain time because that's how things are served. But employment is vast, and there are plenty of roles, especially in the knowledge realm and computer realm, where that flexibility and that rigidity doesn't make sense. So for those of you that are out there going, but in my job, there are some jobs that require structure. I think about pilots and their checklists and all these things for safety. Mm-hmm. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about flexibility in terms of entry. We're talking about flexibility and changes in more direct communication, clarity, assuring understanding before decision making. These are things that, regardless of those jobs, I think we can all bring to the table.
Yeah.
And I know that you and we're talking and we can point a lot of problems out there, but I know there's some success stories too. Do you have any that you can share where you've seen organizations that have really been able to integrate practices that better support autistic individuals?
Yeah. There's a lot of literature actually that shows managers who have worked with autistic individuals are much more likely to hire additional autistic individuals in the future. I think that says a lot. I just want to put that out there first and foremost. Kind of getting in the door, having that experience, you realize, wow, this is actually a lot more positive than expected. When I talk to those sort of managers, and I know, Teresa, you know this from your research too, the success stories oftentimes are around, let's just, I guess, go to the manager for a minute, manager level. They're flexible. They take time to listen, help get at the root of the issues. They're willing to adapt. They create psychological safety within the team. I think that's critical. I also think that in terms of inclusive practices and success stories, I've seen a lot of companies that really lean into the ERG, the employee resource groups. I've seen some companies that have neurodiversity ERG groups. And what I found is a lot of times they have some good influence. They can impact and, suggest what events the company plans. They even, in our case with our company, a lot of times they'll influence and drive the benefits that the companies will buy. And so I do think that that's been something that really helps companies to be more inclusive, is if you put the time and energy into creating ERGs and lifting them up and giving them some power, that can really help to influence some overall successes at the company, kind of have some trickle down effects.
And not just for feel-good events. Like some ERGs are really just like their little in-tech communities and feel-good events, but really bringing them to the table when we think about reviewing policies and changes in healthcare and, workplace practices, compensation practices. Mobility opportunities and how that's all going. Like your BRGs or ERGs, whatever we're, depending on your industry, really help give that insight.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been pleasantly surprised too at the amount of influence that some organizations give their ERGs and BRGs. And it's, when you really see allies partnering with the main people who are chairing these groups, neurodivergent individuals, allies together, kind of, I've seen that be very, very successful. And that's when you start to, you grow, and the companies are listening to these groups, and they're kind of sharing information and resources and bubbling it up. And so I've seen some good successes when it comes to ERGs. Yeah.
And with listening and allies and reflection, I want to run something past us that I thought was really interesting. And I'd love your take on it, and really want the audience to reflect on this scenario. That one of the things that sometimes managers are concerned with, and you mentioned this, is some sort of disruption. And oftentimes I have heard that employees will report that when they have an autistic employee, they're disruptive. Like they talk about things that are off topic, and, they go on these spirals and conversations, and it's like disruptive to the team. Before you respond to that, I counter the conversation saying, does anybody on the team ever talk about the Super Bowl? Like, does everybody at the workplace always talk on workplace topics, or do you guys have side conversations? They're like, well, of course we have side conversations. I said, so do you feel that this employee has more side conversations than you have side conversations? And they're like, no, but they talk about things. And I said, I'm going to stop you there, that nobody cares about. They're like, we didn't say that. I go, I said it for you. And so, but that's one of the things that I want to throw out to the audience, that one of the things that can create dissonance is autistic folks. It's not just that they think differently, but they may have different interests, and they're not necessarily normative. So while many people today are talking about the Super Bowl and Taylor Swift, there is a whole population of people that didn't watch the Super Bowl and maybe don't even know who Taylor Swift is, neurodivergent or not. Like that's not an autistic thing. But I think we need to be mindful that when we introduce somebody new who may think differently than us, have different experiences, they may also have different interests. So while you're talking about the Super Bowl, do you make space for other topics? And what does it say? What does it say when you're like, oh, they're disruptive because they talk about things that none of us can relate to? How do you help employees get, obviously talking to that whole team, we were able to have the aha moment, but how do you get others to kind of come along with, how do you make space for true differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. I think that's what we need to keep reflecting on. I think if everybody agreed with that, then we would be so much further along than we are. But I do think that drawing parallels to related examples like you just mentioned, Teresa, I think that can help people get a framework in their mind to understand this. So tying in something that's relatable to them. This is definitely difficult. It kind of goes, for me, and I always go back to, who sets the norms? Who sets the standards? And you're going to get people, you're going to get all sorts of different people on your team. One thing that I have found on my team as well, actually, is if you go against this kind of, let's create an echo chamber, if you kind of disrupt that a little bit and you do recognize, there's a article you probably know, neurodiversity is a competitive advantage, Austin and Pisano, it's 2017. It's, it's a good one, especially for folks that are kind of new. But if you put in that a little extra effort and you realize, hey, working in an echo chamber, well, it might appear harmonious, it's actually not going to be great for innovation and business. So yeah, it can be a little hard to kind of take those first steps. But what I've done on my team is I've purposely tried to create a diverse team. And you know what? It's not always the most comfortable. Sometimes somebody might say something that makes someone else feel uncomfortable, or different or new. But at the end of the day, not only are we better supporting our clients because we have different viewpoints, but we're actually growing as people too. But that's the nice collateral benefit of this, is that my team, my clinicians are actually better at their job because they're not just all thinking the same way. So, it does take a little bit of work, but when you recognize that it's actually beneficial, you start to see the gains in your company and the gains on your team over time.
I like your concept of the echo chamber. One of the things a colleague of mine wrote about not too long ago was, he wrote, are you diverse, but only in how you define it? Mm-hmm. Are you inclusive where you feel comfortable, right? And so we want to be very mindful that, are you still you want to increase diversity, but do you have a comfort threshold? What I would challenge that, which is true, is that everybody's on a different place in their journey. If you were completely new to this, you're hearing about autism for the first time, your first step is to learn more, not necessarily invite a bunch of people in. There is a little bit of preparation for any employee, guest, right? Do your homework. Where do you have opportunities? Because if you don't have openly autistic or neurodivergent people in your company today, because I guarantee they're there, but if they're not openly autistic, you need to identify what would be keeping people from even disclosing to begin with, right? And if you do have openly autistic employees, but you don't have money, then you can start looking at, what are we doing in terms of our hiring practices? Right. Your level of engagement and awareness, everybody's going to be on this different journey. Regardless of that journey, what do you envision the future of work looking like with the integration of autistic individuals?
Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic. I'm pretty encouraged. I have seen, just in my years of working in this space, more and more companies that are moving in the kind of quote unquote right direction. So we've seen DEIA programs focus on gender and race and sexual identity, sexual orientation, and so on. But and I've been trying to, in my meetings and in speaking events, talk about, we need a seat at the table as well for neurodiversity, and I'm starting to see that more and more. When we also look at the newer generations coming in to work, these folks are more people-centric. They are taking that approach versus kind of the hustle culture. They are thinking about balance. They're thinking about advocating for themselves. And I think that when the people demand it, again, we saw this with COVID, when people are demanding certain things, organizations are more apt to listen. So I am encouraged based on what I've seen thus far.
And so before we get into the workplace, there's the supports outside of it. So educators, community leaders, what can they do to help grease the wheels? Because you just said public sentiment is a huge sway to progress. So what could they be doing to help encourage employers to do more?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that the onus is not solely on the organizations. Community leaders can really elevate public figures, demonstrating different ways of thinking. I do think there's a lot of good work to be done in the schools. I can just speak from my own experience as a mother. I'm so pleasantly surprised at some of that, social emotional learning type programs that my kids' school is putting in place. They're talking significantly about bullying. They're talking about differences. They're talking about embracing differences, kind of that social awareness, self-awareness. They have talked significantly about autism as well. I actually volunteered myself to go and read a book when my older daughter was in first grade about autism. And the teacher was like, yes, please come. We actually have a theme this week just about autism. And it was really cool to see schools lean into this. Now, schools are different all across the country and in the world, but I am seeing a good shift. And I will say that I think there is some onus on the school system because this is where kids are starting to formulate opinions and assumptions. And if the schools can embrace and celebrate differences, and being different is actually a good thing and it's not a scary thing, but this is kind of cool. You can learn new things from your classmates. That gives us a good foundation. So we go in with a different lens, we go in from different perspectives. So when we get to the workplace, we're set up in a much better spot to accept our colleagues.
I love that. I do think you start young because the schema they build about abilities or lack thereof starts early.
Yeah.
If you were part of cliques and bullying in high school, I don't know how you're going to be a great inclusive boss,
right?
The year later, right? So we do really want to watch, what are we teaching our kids? What are we creating as a micro society? Because that's going to inform a macro society. And I think businesses, because of laws and regulation, they tend to be on the forefront of inclusion because they have to be. Mm-hmm. But the people coming in, especially let's just pick on our 18-year-olds, just came out of a clique segmented mentality. Most high schools have the in and out crowd and the different little crowds. And then they're supposed to come into the workplace and work across generations and levels and differences. So what advice do you have for managers and organizations? How do we prioritize this? Because you're going to get different aptitudes coming in.
Yeah, I think being very overt about the kind of the culture at the company, not tolerating any sort of in-group or out-group culture. And from day one, companies can do a really good job of communicating this and kind of marketing this. I talked about this also in my research, that companies need to do a better job of highlighting what they are doing. Hey, we're an inclusive workplace. These are the things that we're doing. These are measurable things that we're doing to attract good talent where people feel safe to go there. But it needs to come from the leadership. We don't tolerate in-group, out-group. We don't tolerate workplace bullying. We elevate and love diversity. We want diversity. That's what makes us great. So I think that it needs to come from the top, trickle down, not have a zero tolerance policy. I think also you can poll your employees to see how you're doing. So if you have these goals and you publicly, publish results and, you really, really double down and actually do some surveying to see, is this a psychologically safe workplace? How are we doing in these areas? Do you feel safe to disclose? Do you feel like you've been a recipient of any bullying or retaliation because you receive accommodations, whatever it is? I think there are definitely some measurable behaviors that we can do to create more inclusive workplaces.
And I like your guidelines and guardrails. I once had somebody say to me, you can't change the hearts and minds of, everyone, but I can create rules of engagement when you work for me or when you work there. And I do think that sometimes the rules beget the change to hearts and minds. So I think of the military, young people going in, maybe not great at discipline, all these things. When they come out, most have adopted pretty rigorous discipline and all these things, and they adopted that within themselves. So I don't a lot of times I think awareness and we're trying to change hearts and minds before we change behavior. As an organization, it's almost easier to create the rule set of expected behaviors and engagement. That's what schools do, right? You go to a military academy. they're still all 12-year-olds, but they're operating at a very different way and level because the rules of success have been defined for good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
That's a different conversation. But over time, it does start to shift that mindset. So I like that you talked about that, like create these rules. Here's how we operate. Is there anything else that you want to really share with our listeners that are like, this is how we overcome this?
Yeah, this is tough. I will say it takes work, right? It's maybe not our nature sometimes to change things up, to dismantle certain things that have been in place for a long time, or to do something that is unfamiliar because it's maybe not comfortable. But I do encourage people to stretch themselves a little bit, not because it's the right thing to do, but to educate yourself on the fact that it actually will make your team stronger. And so, yeah, I would encourage people to think outside of their normal day to day. And I think it goes back to that self-reflection. How am I doing as a leader? What are the data showing in terms of how my employees feel about their work here? Is there something that I can be doing that's a little bit better at making people feel a little bit more comfortable? You're going to see more productivity that way as well. That's pretty clear in the literature. So, yeah, I think that would be kind of my parting words, is to stretch yourself a little bit, do a little bit more education, get outside the box. And I think you're going to see some major benefits that you didn't originally think of.
I love that. And I love that you don't have to be afraid to stretch yourself outside the box. You might find something wonderful.
Yeah.
When you step out. Is there any way for folks to contact you? Should they have any additional questions that they'd like to reach out?
Oh, sure. Yeah. They can contact me. I'll give you my Gmail address. It's just adagost@gmail.com. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any and all questions.
Angela loves data and research, and she has lots of it. Angela, I can't thank you enough for being with me today. I was so excited when your study was published because it showed us that we've made so many gains and it's all solvable, but there's still so much more work to be done. And sometimes having that validation that we still have work to be done is the catalyst that we need to get the resources, to get the voice we need to make that change happen. So I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today. And I look forward to chatting again soon.
Thank you so much for having me on today, Teresa.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank Audio Work Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.